In the decades after the Second World War, a number of conflicts broke out across the British Empire in opposition to colonial rule. In Kenya, in particular, the Mau Mau uprising prompted a violent and brutal response from British forces. Between 1952 and 1960, the Kenyan emergency was shaped by mass detention, forced labour and human rights violations. It was a tragic period of repression, and yet it also formed a crucial step towards Kenya's eventual independence from colonial rule.
We're standing in IWM's new exhibition, Emergency Exits, the Fight for Independence in Malaya, Kenya and Cyprus. An exhibition which looks at the breakup of the British Empire following the end of the Second World War. For many people across Britain's empire, the end of the Second World War marked the beginning of another struggle, a fight to shape the future of their nations, independent from British colonial rule. And whilst the transition to self-governance and independence for some of Britain's imperial territories was fairly peaceful, for Kenya it was more complicated and violent.
If you were white in Kenya, it was quite a lavish lifestyle. There's this kind of famed idea of what they called the Happy Valley, which was this kind of very fertile land in central Kenya that was given to white settlers, and where they kind of had this raucous party lifestyle based on the profits of their ranch-style farming. If you were Black African in Kenya during the colonial period, life was a lot different than that. You most likely lived on a native reserve in central Kenya especially, and these native reserves were specific demarcated areas where people who had been dispossessed of their land to make room for white settlers were forced to live. This obviously caused a lot of division and a lot of discontent among people whose traditional agrarian way of life had been completely disrupted.
Forced to pay hefty poll and hut taxes, many chose to leave the reserves to find work on European farms, but their movement was controlled by colonial authorities, who required them to wear an identity card around their neck at all times.
Na mĩgũnda-inĩ ĩyo twarĩ gũtiarĩ kĩndũ gĩa kũrehe mbeca ta kahũa, ndũngĩetĩkĩrio ũhande kahũa nĩ mũkoroni mũthũngũ. Ũguo twarĩ andũ athĩni mũno. Nĩgetha tũtũũre tũkĩruta wĩra. Naguo gũkĩgĩa na andũ monaga kana magĩthomete makona tũtirĩ ngombo, makambia gwĩciria ũrĩa tũngĩhota kũregana na wathani wao nĩgetha tũgakinya kũrũkũrũkũrũ. Ũguo rĩu mũthũngũ rĩ ndatwĩka wega, na nĩkĩo twajiungire na athuri arĩa makĩrĩ nĩ kũrĩ ithuĩ.
A generation of politically and economically disenfranchised young men and women became radicalised and joined the militant organisation Mau Mau. A series of attacks on settler farms and on key figures loyal to the colonial authorities prompted Britain to declare a state of emergency. New emergency regulations imposed curfews, censorship, control of movement, collective punishments and detention without trial. Labelling these conflicts emergencies also ensured that the insurance policies of the European settlers were not compromised, since many would not have been compensated for damage to their property or business if it happened as a result of war.
In addition to these new emergency powers, the Mau Mau were also declared a terrorist organisation, which gave the colonial government the political and legal justification to treat them far more harshly.
They were codified as terrorists under emergency law, so in the eyes of the colonial powers that meant that as terrorists they could be detained without trial and lost other sort of basic human rights.
Over 1 million Kenyans were forcibly resettled from their homes into over 800 centralised and enclosed guarded villages. Under constant control and surveillance from nearby Home Guard posts, civilian support for the Mau Mau fighters was significantly weakened. Daily life was often brutal, with curfews, collective punishments, forced labour and restrictions on their movement.
people's original homes were often burned down, and they were forced to carry a minimal amount of belongings into small huts where they would live in very close quarters with other families, not necessarily from their exact same communities. In those emergency villages, torture and sexual violence and extreme harassment were also widespread.
Tuli gicagi vikalo ekejo ekali visirio wakorwo nĩ mũrango ũmwe rĩu nyambo ikaiga angĩtũkinyagia haha rĩ ũka haha rĩu haha rĩu nĩ wa fiti cigana wa fiti ici inya nathi rĩu igathecererwo mĩnyama ikarigicĩrio kũndũ guo atĩ we ndũngiuma haha ũrũge ũthiĩ harĩa.
This simi, or Kikuyu machete, was used by Mau Mau during the emergency. Whilst items like these have often been categorised as weapons, they also had other uses, including cutting through dense vegetation, enabling fighters to move through the forests. Items like these were brought back by British soldiers and kept as souvenirs, eventually working their way into museums like ours. Despite their other uses, they came to symbolise the brutality of Mau Mau during this period, and on this particular weapon there is an engraving which references the 1953 Larry Massacre. The Larry Massacre was one of the most violent incidents of the emergency, where several hundred Mau Mau targeted a well-known loyalist community who supported the British colonial administration, resulting in the deaths of around 75 civilians. In retaliation, loyalist forces killed at least twice the number of suspected Mau Mau supporters the next day. These bloody events led to intense and bitter grievance within the Larry community, which continued in the decades that followed. Whilst it is highly unlikely that this simi was directly used during these events in Larry, the engraving highlights how items like this came to symbolise the extreme brutality and violence associated with the Mau Mau movement. The Larry Massacre was a major turning point in the emergency, intensifying conflict within communities in Kenya and enabling the colonial authorities to reinforce narratives of Mau Mau barbarity. Other stories of violence perpetuated by colonial forces have largely been forgotten, such as the 1959 Hola Massacre, where 11 men died in a detention camp in Hola in northern Kenya. It was insinuated at the time that these individuals had died after drinking contaminated water, but 8 days later it was found that they had died due to their injuries of multiple bruising caused by violence.
Detention was an extremely violent and brutal experience. The detention process was kind of conceptualized as a way to root out the sort of Mau Mau sentiments from society and kind of kill off revolutionary spirit. So this was done through torturous means, through sexual violence, through forced labour, and all of this is without any sort of trial. People were moved through a series of camps of different intensities until they were basically deemed to be sort of rehabilitated and able to be released back into society. However, the society that they were released back into was also a form of detention.
Mau Mau fighters would acquire their firearms through raiding European settler farms and police or military bases. But with a shortage of weapons available to them, many weapons were often improvised from locally available materials such as barbed wire, bolts or iron nails, and water pipes which were used for the gun barrels. They were made in the forest in improvised workshops and usually had a striking resemblance to European rifles or pistols. This particular firearm was made by a Mau Mau supporter who went under the name of Lieutenant General Dr. Russia. He had a specialist role in producing firearms for a section of Mau Mau fighters in the forest, but in 1956 he was detained and later ended up in Karatina detention camp. He would later write of his grief and horror after being detained and locked in a cell, despite already confessing to his role of producing guns for the movement.
Twakenyuĩte gũga tũkena na tũtikagũrana tũtikanyitana ngati na mau. Twayũkire tũgĩtharĩkĩra mabuci ta kwa Ruka, kwa Ikenye, na ithuĩ nĩtwahota ũrĩa tene twathiĩ nĩtwamakoraga tũkamahũra, tũgatharia kambĩ ng'ima tũkahũra. Twahakanagio mũndũ wa mũcinga, na mũndũ wa banga, na mũndũ wa rũhiũ rwa njora, tũkahakanio ũguo. Rĩu mũndũ rĩrĩa wĩra wa banga ũraruta wĩra, mũndũ wa mũcinga ndangĩrathũkia. Rĩu kwa ũrũme waku no camba waku. Kũng'etha ũmenye mũndũ ũcio ndarakũnengera ũguo, mũkamemania, ũmũtorie kana agũtorie.
Home guards were a kind of a complicated status. So home guards were often the executors of violence with the sort of oversight and full knowledge and often at the direct instruction of colonial officers. Many people began as Mau Mau and moved towards Home Guard later into the 50s as the war went on and they became kind of more despairing at the sort of the violence and the brutality and the lack of kind of material successes that the Mau Mau movement were having. So to join the Home Guard was not necessarily to be ideologically aligned with the colonial regime. It was often a survival strategy or a kind of a way of looking to negotiate your rights and your independence.
The origin of the term Mau Mau is unknown, and according to some members, they never referred to themselves as such, suggesting the British preferred to use it as a way of denying their legitimacy, instead of using the military title Kenya Land and Freedom Army, or KLFA. The Mau Mau wanted to be seen as a legitimate organisation with a governmental structure, rather than the brutal barbarians that colonial forces portrayed them to be.
This object looks fairly ordinary, but it's one of the rarest objects in the museum's collection. It's a document stamp bearing a depiction of Mount Kenya, a sacred mountain with spiritual significance in Kikuyu culture. There are traditional weapons on top and text which roughly translates as "a blacksmith is the shield of the tribe." It may have been used in communication by those in the forest who were crafting weapons for Mau Mau fighters, and highlights the importance of their role in producing equipment to support their operations against British forces. Many other samples of stationery and rubber stamps like this were found in the forest by British forces, including examples relating to the Kenya Parliament, which is how the leading figures of Mau Mau referred to themselves as early as 1954. Colonial propaganda aimed to emphasise the violent ruthlessness and savagery of Mau Mau. But these objects provide insight into their core motivations and highlight the degree of internal organisation within the movement. They demonstrate that Mau Mau had implemented bureaucratic processes to politically debate and discuss the future of Kenya in the forest, and had aspirations of establishing an alternative government.
The Mau Mau didn't necessarily have the widespread support of Kenya as a whole. Kenya is made up of over 40 different tribes and ethnicities across 3 major languages and cultural families. The Mau Mau uprising was primarily driven by the Kikuyu, but also involved some Embu and Meru communities.
So some people really saw them as freedom fighters, and the Mau Mau perceived themselves as freedom fighters for a sort of Kikuyu self-governance or self-mastery, and also for a wider Kenyan independence. However, there were people among Kenyan society who took issue with Mau Mau's methods, because it was the case that they did enact quite brutal violence on those they perceived as their enemies. So they weren't universally loved and revered within Kenya.
Whilst the Mau Mau are estimated to have had 35,000 active members at its peak, as many as 160,000 people were forcibly detained under suspicion of Mau Mau affiliation, often simply for being Kikuyu. Other groups were fighting for independence in different ways. The Kenya African Union was the main group leading the political campaign for Kenyan independence. Led by Jomo Kenyatta, they organised rallies and advocated for constitutional reforms throughout the 40s and 50s. Kenyatta was arrested in 1952 when the emergency was declared. Despite limited evidence ever linking him to the armed rebellion, he spent nearly 9 years in prison, accused of masterminding the Mau Mau uprising. His detention was a political move by the British, designed to suppress nationalist leadership during the emergency. But his wrongful detention strengthened his cause, turning him into a symbol of resistance and a figure who represented independence.
This police uniform was worn by a chief superintendent in the Kenya Police, and the truncheon is typical of those carried by the police at the time. Policing expanded and intensified as a result of the emergency, with thousands joining the Kenya Police and Police Reserve, and hundreds of more experienced police officers recruited and transferred from Britain. The police now became involved in joint operations against Mau Mau with the army, effectively militarising the police. They oversaw many of the operations that resulted in the detention of tens of thousands of people suspected of supporting the fighters and the forcible resettlement of millions more into guarded villages. Whilst command positions were occupied by British soldiers, most members of the police force were Kenyan.
The capture of Mau Mau leader Dedan Kimathi in late 1956 marked the effective defeat of the movement. He was executed by the British colonial government a few months later. The fighting had diminished by the late 50s, and yet the state of emergency remained in place, with thousands of Kikuyu still detained in camps. It wasn't until 1960 that the British government formally lifted the emergency. The uprising, despite being crushed militarily, forced Britain to accelerate Kenya's path to independence, as criticism of Britain's harsh methods began to grow, especially after reports of torture and mass detentions. Jomo Kenyatta was released from prison in 1961 and began leading the Kenya African National Union political party. Kenya achieved its independence on December 12, 1963, with Kenyatta as its new Prime Minister.
So Mau Mau was defeated and kind of sacrificed in order for Kenya to gain independence. Mau Mau maintained its status as a terrorist organisation after independence. It was still seen as a politically dangerous movement, and the sentiments that had kind of inspired Mau Mau, especially kind of the movement against land alienation and the movement kind of for a return to a different way of life, were never successful and were kind of threatening to the ambitions of the post-independence government. Several Mau Mau fighters remained in the forest and refused to leave after independence, arguing that sort of their vision of independence had yet to be fulfilled. But the Kenyan government under Jomo Kenyatta kind of rooted them out, pulled them out of the forest, and adopted a sort of curated idea of what Mau Mau was, centering Jomo Kenyatta as the hero of independence and the sort of spiritual and political leader of the nation, and especially of the Kikuyu people.
For decades, the British government argued that the responsibility for the torture and mistreatment of Mau Mau detainees lay with the Kenyan government. Then, in 2011, the High Court in London ruled that claims could proceed, and in 2013, the British government officially acknowledged that Kenyans were subject to torture and ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration. Britain agreed to pay £19.9 million to over 5,000 Mau Mau survivors.
Within Kenya, Mau Mau has kind of come full circle and is viewed as the independence movement, especially by kind of younger generations who on the whole are very inspired by the sort of bravery of the Mau Mau. They're now kind of perceived as heroes. I think it's interesting that now that most of the Mau Mau fighters are kind of in their last years of life, and many of them have already died, they kind of pose less of a threat in the reality of who they were, and so it's much easier to cast them as sort of abstract heroes.